He heard it. Daddy. Not loudly, not playfully, not like children teasing a stranger in an elevator. Soft, certain, claimed, and the strangest part wasn't the whisper. It was that no one laughed. The elevator had just left the lobby of a 47-story glass tower in Midtown Manhattan. Steel walls, digital floor numbers blinking upward, a faint scent of expensive cologne and someone's coconut conditioner mingling in the close air. The kind of silence New Yorkers respect. Eyes forward, bodies still, conversations saved for sidewalks. Richard stood near the control panel, tailored navy suit pressed sharp enough to cut doubt in half. His biggest investor stood beside him, hands folded, watch gleaming under recessed lighting. A billion-dollar merger waiting upstairs. Across from them stood Zuri, 33, composed, brown eyes steady as Sunday morning prayer, one hand resting lightly on the shoulders of two little girls with matching curls and identical pink sneakers that blinked when they shifted their feet. 5-year-old twins. Felicity leaned forward first. Abigail followed. And together, like they had practiced it in a whisper only sisters understand, they said it again. Daddy. No giggle. No mischief. Just truth. Richard didn't move, didn't blink. For a man who had negotiated hostile takeovers without raising his pulse, this was the first time his heart forgot its rhythm. Because elevators in New York come with rules. You step in, you turn around, you face the door, you pretend strangers don't exist. But there is no rule for when your past steps inside with pigtails and calls you father. The investor slowly turned his head, not confused, measuring. Zuri didn't rush to explain, didn't flinch. She simply looked at Richard the way someone looks at a man who once promised forever under city lights and never came back to collect it. And in that sealed metal box rising toward power and profit, the air shifted. He had built an empire that touched 5 continents, yet somehow, 2 small voices had just reached further. Before this elevator reaches the 47th floor, a decision will be made that costs more than any merger, not in dollars, in identity. By the time those doors open again, Richard will no longer be just a billionaire CEO preparing to secure his largest deal. He will be a man exposed in front of the one person whose opinion can multiply his empire, or quietly pull away from it. Because here's the truth about power in New York. The city doesn't judge you for how high you rise. It watches how you stand when something pulls you back down to earth. The investor didn't gasp, didn't scold, didn't smile. He just watched. And sometimes the most dangerous witness in a room is the one who says nothing. Richard finally exhaled. I think you're mistaken, he said carefully, voice controlled, polished, the same tone he used in boardrooms when correcting projections without bruising egos. Felicity tilted her head. Abigail stepped closer to Zuri's leg but kept her eyes on him. Children have a way of studying adults like they're trying to solve a math problem. And right now, Richard wasn't adding up. Zuri's expression didn't crack. Not anger, not accusation, just a calm that felt earned. You should look at them, she said softly. That wasn't drama. That was instruction. The investor's watch caught the light again. 41 seconds had passed since the first whisper. The elevator hummed upward. Floor numbers blinking like a quiet countdown. Richard felt heat gather behind his collar. He had faced regulators, faced lawsuits, faced reporters hungry for weakness. But this was different. Because in business, you prepare for risk. In life, sometimes the risk prepares for you. And if these girls were telling the truth, if that word meant what it sounded like, then 5 years of silence had just walked into the room wearing blinking sneakers. The investor adjusted his cuff slightly. A subtle movement, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that asks, what kind of man are you, really? Men who run companies, men who dominate markets, men who speak confidently about legacy. But what about the kind of man who disappears? What about the kind of man who builds towers and forgets who waited at the bottom? The elevator kept climbing, and judgment wasn't coming from the boardroom upstairs. It was already here. The elevator grew quieter than it had any right to be. Even the hum of the cables felt distant. Richard stared at the closed steel doors as if they might open early and rescue him from this moment. They didn't. Elevators don't rush for anyone, not even billionaires. Felicity's small hand rested against his pant leg now, steady, certain, Abigail leaned her head slightly, studying his face the way children study a photo they've seen before. And in that silence, a question floated between them. Not spoken, not forced, just there. Have you ever had your past step into your future without warning? Have you ever built something so tall that you forgot to look back at what you left behind? Because here's the uncomfortable truth about ambition. It demands sacrifice. Time, sleep, relationships, sometimes even love. And in boardrooms across Manhattan, men applaud each other for it. They call it focus. They call it drive. They call it necessary. But no one applauds the 5-year-old who asks where her father went. No one hands out trophies for bedtime stories read by one parent instead of two. The investor cleared his throat softly. Not impatient, just aware. The floor numbers blinked past 22, 23, 24. This wasn't just a personal moment. This was leverage. Richard's voice lowered. Zuri, what is this? Her name left his mouth like something he hadn't touched in years. She didn't raise her voice. It's truth, she replied. Simple, direct, unshaken. And that word, truth, carries more weight than any contract upstairs. Let me ask you something. What would you do if the life you postponed showed up before you could prepare a response? What would you say if 2 little girls called you daddy, in front of the one man about to wire $1 billion into your vision? Would you deny? Would you deflect? Or would you finally stand still long enough to listen? Because this story right here, this moment, isn't just about Richard. It's about choices. It's about what success means when no one is clapping. And if you've ever wrestled with ambition and responsibility, if you've ever wondered whether it's too late to fix something you once walked away from, then do something simple for me right now. Tap that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, not for algorithms alone, though yes, it helps push stories like this into spaces that need them, but because stories about accountability deserve light. They deserve conversation. They deserve reflection. The elevator hit the 31st floor, and still, no one laughed. Let me slow this down. Because this wasn't chaos. There was no shouting, no dramatic pointing, no security rushing in, just 4 adults, if you count the investor's silence, and 2 5-year-old girls standing inside a moving box suspended between floors and between past and present. And here's what most people get wrong about moments like this. They think the explosion is loud. It isn't. It's quiet. It's the kind of quiet that presses against your chest and makes you aware of your own breathing. Richard finally looked at them. Really looked. Same deep brown eyes he once traced with his thumb while Zuri laughed under string lights in Greenwich Village. Same stubborn little crease between the brows when concentrating. Felicity lifted her chin. You forgot us, she said, not accusing, just stating what she believed to be a fact. Abigail reached into the small denim pocket of her dress. And that's when the second shift happened. Not dramatic, not rushed, just deliberate. She pulled out a thin leather bracelet, worn at the edges, metal crest slightly faded but still clear. Richard's college crest, the one he hadn't seen since the summer he thought ambition could wait. He felt it before he understood it. That slight tightening in the throat, that sudden rush of memory, Zuri's fingers brushing that same bracelet on his wrist years ago, teasing him about how seriously he took himself back then. You left it, Abigail said softly, holding it up as if returning something misplaced. The investor's eyes flicked to the bracelet, back to Richard, and stayed there. Floor 38, 39, 40. Now this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Now this had evidence. And the real question wasn't whether Richard recognized it. It was whether he recognized himself. Because sometimes proof doesn't come in court documents or DNA tests. Sometimes it comes in a small hand offering back what you thought you lost. The elevator kept rising. And upstairs, a boardroom waited. But right here, a reckoning had already begun. There are moments in a man's life when money becomes very small. This was one of them. Richard didn't reach for the bracelet right away. He just stared at it, at the tiny scratches near the clasp, the faint bend along the metal crest where it had once caught on a subway turnstile years ago. He remembered that day. Zuri laughing at him for wrestling with a machine that didn't care about his resume. He had been younger then, hungry, certain that the only way to love someone properly was to become powerful enough to protect them. But somewhere along that climb, he confused protection with absence. Felicity stepped closer, close enough that the blinking lights on her sneakers reflected against his polished shoes. "You used to wear it," she said. "Used to." Children speak in simple tenses. They don't complicate timelines. They don't soften truths. "Used to." Zuri's eyes never left his face. Not challenging, not pleading, just steady. She had done 5 years of hard things without him. Doctor visits, parent-teacher conferences, midnight fevers, rent increases, career negotiations, church Sundays where the twins asked why other kids had fathers sitting beside them. And she had answered with dignity. She had never poisoned his name. She had never trained her daughters to hate him. That's what made this moment heavier, because this wasn't revenge. This was revelation. The investor shifted his weight slightly. Not impatient, not amused, observing, assessing. In business, Richard often said, "Character is currency." He said it on podcasts. He said it at conferences. He said it when mentoring young executives who admired his trajectory. But character isn't tested when everything goes your way. It's tested when something you avoided steps back into your line of sight. The elevator reached the 44th floor. Time was narrowing. Zuri finally spoke again. "They don't need your money," she said quietly. "They need to know who you are, not what you earn, not what you own, who you are." And in that tight metal space, suspended between lobby and luxury, between history and opportunity, Richard felt something unfamiliar press against his chest. Not fear, not anger. Responsibility, the kind that doesn't disappear when ignored. The kind that waits, sometimes for years. Because here's the truth. Most people don't say out loud, success can build towers, but only integrity builds homes. And right now, standing between $1 billion future and 2 blinking pairs of sneakers, Richard had to decide which one he wanted to walk into. The elevator slowed. 46, 47. The doors prepared to open. And the real investment was no longer upstairs. The elevator hadn't opened yet, but something already had. Not a door. A memory, a consequence, a mirror. And before those steel panels slide apart and carry this story into a boardroom where numbers will be discussed like oxygen, let's breathe for a second. Because what you just witnessed wasn't just tension. It was truth colliding with timing. It was a man who mastered negotiation, suddenly unable to negotiate with 5-year-old certainty. It was a woman who raised 2 daughters without bitterness, choosing presence over humiliation. And it was a silent investor realizing that the most important asset in this deal wasn't sitting on a spreadsheet. It was standing inside this elevator. Welcome back to Mr. Dave's Stories, where every story reminds us that growth is possible, healing is real, and lessons are everywhere. If this is your first time here, we're honored to have you. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story that might uplift, inspire, or change the way you see life. And while you're here, tap that like button, leave a comment. Share this with someone who understands that ambition is powerful, but accountability is sacred. Because stories like this don't just entertain, they challenge, they hold up a mirror, and sometimes they ask us questions we've been avoiding. Now stay with me, because the elevator doors are about to open. The investor is about to step forward, and Richard, the man who once believed he could schedule every part of his life, is about to learn that some appointments cannot be postponed. Not love, not truth, not fatherhood. The bell dings softly. The doors begin to part. And upstairs, a decision waits. The bell chimed softly. The doors slid apart. 47th floor. The penthouse level of the Midtown Tower opened into polished marble and floor-to-ceiling glass. The skyline stretched wide, the Hudson catching late morning light, traffic below reduced to quiet motion. A long corridor led toward the boardroom where numbers waited, contracts waited, handshakes waited, but no one stepped out. Not immediately. The investor moved first, just half a step forward, then stopped when Richard didn't follow. That pause spoke louder than any whisper. Richard's eyes were still on the bracelet, still on Abigail's small hand, holding it up without accusation. The investor finally turned fully toward him. "Richard," he said calmly, not sharp, not irritated, measured, the kind of tone used when someone is being evaluated without being told they are. Felicity looked out into the hallway and then back at Richard. "Is this where you work?" she asked, curiosity slipping into her voice like sunlight through blinds. Her sneakers blinked once against the elevator floor. Richard swallowed. Yes, he answered automatically. The word felt unfamiliar. Zuri shifted slightly, but did not step forward. She didn't block the exit. She didn't plead. She simply allowed the moment to sit there. The investor checked his watch, not impatiently, just aware. Time, in his world, was currency, and this delay was costing something. Is there a problem? He asked. The question wasn't about logistics. It was about character. Richard straightened his shoulders, instinctively returning to the version of himself that negotiated under pressure. There's been a misunderstanding, he said evenly. Abigail blinked. Felicity frowned. Zuri's gaze didn't change, but something in her stillness deepened. A misunderstanding? She repeated quietly. Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. The elevator doors remained open, waiting for someone to choose a direction. Behind them, somewhere down the hallway, a receptionist's keyboard clicked faintly. Life continuing, deals continuing, the world continuing. Richard finally stepped out into the corridor, not confidently, not hesitantly, or just moving. The investor followed. Zuri and the twins remained inside for half a breath longer, long enough to make the separation visible, then stepped out too. The doors closed behind them. Now there was no metal box to contain the tension. Just open space, open air, open consequences. Zuri, Richard said under his breath, trying to lower the temperature of the moment. This isn't the place. She nodded slightly. I know, she said, but it's the time. The investor's eyes moved from Richard to the girls. He noticed the resemblance now. Anyone looking carefully would. The curve of the nose, the shape of the jawline. He didn't say it, but he saw it. Felicity walked a few steps down the corridor, staring at the city through the glass. Mommy, it's so high, she whispered. Abigail stood close to Zuri, still holding the bracelet out, patient. Richard reached for it. Slowly. His fingers brushed the worn leather. Memory pressed in. Summer air in Greenwich Village. Music spilling onto sidewalks. Zuri laughing because he took himself too seriously. He closed his hand around the bracelet. The investor watched that movement carefully. And that's when Richard made his first mistake. They're not mine, he said. Not loudly. Not cruelly, but firmly. The words landed like something fragile dropped onto marble. Zuri inhaled, just once. Not dramatic. Controlled. You don't know that, she replied. The investor's jaw tightened slightly, because denial is easy in private, but denial in front of witnesses, that's different. Felicity turned around. Her brows furrowed. But you look like us, she said, puzzled more than hurt. Children don't understand strategy. They understand resemblance. They understand tone. They understand when something feels off. Richard felt sweat gather at the base of his neck. The boardroom doors at the end of the hall remained closed. The meeting was scheduled for 10. It was now 1007. 7 minutes. 7 minutes in business is recoverable. 7 minutes in fatherhood can echo for years. The investor stepped closer to Richard, lowering his voice. We can postpone, he said quietly. If you need to handle this. It wasn't generous. It was strategic. He needed to see what kind of man would walk into partnership with him. Richard hesitated. Zuri saw it. That flicker between image and instinct. She didn't push, didn't argue. She just looked at him, and in her eyes there was no hatred, only exhaustion. 5 years of it. 5 years of carrying questions alone. 5 years of bedtime stories without a second voice. Richard, she said gently, they deserve to know who you are, not what you decide. Who you are. The twins stood quietly now. Even Felicity had stopped moving. The hallway felt longer than it had moments ago. The investor took one step back, giving space, not interfering, observing. Richard's heartbeat thudded against his ribs. He could walk into that boardroom, close the deal, secure expansion, strengthen his legacy, and return to this later. Or he could stand here, in discomfort, in uncertainty, in accountability. The bracelet rested heavy in his palm. Zuri didn't move toward him. She didn't move away. She simply waited. The twins waited too. The city stretched beyond the glass, taxis weaving, pedestrians crossing, life happening without pause. Richard looked down at Felicity, then at Abigail, then back at Zuri, and for the first time since the whisper inside the elevator, He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like a man unsure of himself. The investor cleared his throat softly. "We'll reconvene," he said. Not a suggestion, a statement. Richard nodded slowly. The boardroom doors remained closed. The future paused. And in that stillness, something unspoken settled into the air. Because sometimes the quietest word in a room makes the loudest demand, doesn't it? The hallway outside the boardroom felt too wide for what was happening inside it. Glass walls, steel accents, the kind of architecture built to make power look clean. But nothing about this moment felt clean. The investor glanced at his watch again, not sharply, not annoyed, just measuring. His silence was no longer neutral. It was evaluative. 7 minutes had already passed. 8 now. In Manhattan, time doesn't stretch. It invoices you. Abigail still held the bracelet between her fingers. Richard hadn't given it back. He hadn't put it on either. It rested in his palm like something unfinished. Felicity tugged lightly at his sleeve. "Do you have a big office?" she asked. Her voice carried no tension. Just curiosity. Richard blinked, almost startled by the normalcy of the question. "Yes," he said quietly. "Does it have snacks?" She continued. The investor's mouth twitched, not a smile exactly, but something close. Abigail, noticing the silence tightening again, reached into her tiny backpack. After a second of careful searching, she pulled out a small juice box and extended it toward Richard. "You look thirsty," she offered. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. It was instinct. Zuri's eyes flickered briefly, not in embarrassment, not in pride, just in recognition of how children respond to discomfort. They try to fix it with what they have. Richard looked at the juice box, then at Abigail. His throat felt dry. "I'm okay," he said, though he wasn't sure that was true. A thin line of perspiration traced down his spine beneath the pressed fabric of his shirt. He was used to pressure, used to negotiations that felt like chess matches with real money on the table. But this wasn't strategy. This was exposure. The investor stepped slightly to the side, creating distance from the boardroom doors. A subtle signal to the assistant at the far end of the corridor that the meeting would not begin on time. "We can reschedule," he said calmly. "If necessary, not generosity. Observation." Richard's pulse thudded in his ears. Zuri finally stepped forward just enough to stand beside her daughters, not shielding them, just present. "They deserve to know who you are," she said. It wasn't accusation, it was invitation. And that sentence, it didn't echo in the hallway. It echoed inside him. Because 5 years ago, on a warm summer night in Greenwich Village, he had promised her something very close to that. He had stood outside a jazz club where the trumpets spilled onto the sidewalk and told her, "I want you to know exactly who I am." Back then, it sounded romantic. Now it sounded unfinished. The bracelet pressed into his skin, and memory came back sharp and uninvited. He remembered the night he lost it. He had been rushing, always rushing, trying to catch a cab near Union Square after telling Zuri he needed to leave for what was supposed to be a 3-month expansion project. 3 months. He had said it like a temporary inconvenience. She had tried to smile, tried to be supportive. But when he reached for her hand that night, she held it a second longer than usual, as if she already sensed distance stretching wider than geography. The bracelet had slipped from his wrist somewhere between the cab door and the airport terminal. He never went back to look for it. He told himself it was just an accessory, but here it was, in his daughter's hand. And that word, daughter, hovered in his thoughts like something fragile he wasn't ready to claim. The investor observed the shift in Richard's expression. This wasn't about scandal. This was about decision-making under moral weight. Felicity stepped closer again. "Mommy says you're busy," she said matter-of-factly. "But busy people still come home." The hallway grew still. Zuri inhaled slowly, not to interrupt, not to coach, just breathing through the moment. Richard crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to eye level with the twins. A move that surprised even him. "What did your mommy tell you about me?" he asked carefully. Abigail answered first. "That you're smart," she said. Felicity added, "and that you left, no bitterness. Just sequence. Smart. Left." The investor looked away briefly toward the skyline, giving the family a sliver of privacy without actually stepping out of earshot. Richard's mind raced. If he acknowledged them here, fully, the story could spread. Assistants talk. Investors evaluate reputation. Markets respond to narrative. If he denied them, firmly, he might secure control of the moment. But control and truth are rarely the same thing. Zuri's gaze never wavered. She wasn't here to embarrass him. She wasn't here to threaten him. She was here because time had run out on silence. The assistant down the corridor approached quietly, tablet in hand. "Should I inform the board we're postponing?" she asked the investor. The investor didn't answer immediately. He looked at Richard, waiting. The hallway clock ticked softly. Richard exhaled. "Yes," he said at last. "Postpone it." The word felt heavier than expected. The assistant nodded and stepped away. The boardroom doors remained closed. Opportunity delayed. Felicity's eyes widened slightly. "You're not going inside?" she asked. Richard shook his head. "Not right now." Abigail's grip on the bracelet loosened as if something invisible had eased. The investor stepped closer again. "Handle this," he said quietly. 2 words. Not command, not threat, expectation. And beneath that expectation was something unspoken, character first, everything else second. Richard nodded once. Zuri studied him carefully, searching for something she hadn't seen in years. Not wealth, not charm, consistency. The twins moved closer to her sides. The corridor felt less like a corporate hallway now, and more like a crossroads, because this had not been random. Zuri had known about the meeting. She had known about the timing. She had chosen this elevator, not for spectacle, for confrontation without escape. And now the question hovered between them. Did she plan this? Or did fate simply align what had been overdue? Richard rose slowly from his crouch. He looked at Zuri. Really looked. Not at the past, not at the bracelet. At her. "You should have told me," he said quietly. Her response was immediate, but gentle. "You should have answered." The investor turned slightly toward the elevators. "I'll give you time," he said. Then he walked toward the stairwell instead of the waiting lift, leaving Richard standing in the corridor between legacy and responsibility. The city shimmered outside the glass. Richard watched the twins, the way they stood close to Zuri, the way they glanced at him without fear. And in that suspended moment, success felt very different than it had 10 minutes ago. When success finally looks back at you, do you recognize what it sees? The hallway slowly returned to movement. Assistants resumed walking. Phones began ringing again. The world of business inhaled as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside Richard, something had shifted. The investor disappeared down the stairwell without another word. Not angry, not dismissive, just observant. A man who understood that the real negotiation was no longer financial. Richard stood still for a moment longer, staring at the closed boardroom doors. 5 years of forward motion, 5 years of expansion, 5 years of telling himself that what he left behind would stay behind. Zuri adjusted the strap of her purse and gently placed her hand on Felicity's shoulder. "We should go," she said softly. Not cold, not defeated, simply practical. Felicity hesitated, but he didn't say bye. Zuri's eyes flickered briefly toward Richard, then back to her daughter. "Sometimes grown-ups need a minute," she said. Abigail slipped her small hand into Zuri's. Richard watched that gesture, the quiet instinct of protection, of connection. He had seen it before. Zuri always reached for hands when things felt uncertain. He opened his mouth, closed it. The elevator at the end of the hall chimed again. Zuri didn't wait for an invitation. She turned, guiding the twins toward it. Richard followed a few steps behind, not close enough to lead, not distant enough to detach. The ride down was quieter than the ride up. No whispers this time. No declarations, just reflection. Felicity leaned her head lightly against the mirrored wall, studying her own blinking shoes. Abigail traced her finger along the seam of the elevator panel. Zuri faced the doors, composed. Richard stood beside her, the bracelet still wrapped loosely in his palm. The floor numbers counted downward. 47, 46, 45. Each number felt like a descent not just in height, but in illusion. In the reflection of the elevator wall, he caught sight of himself standing next to them. The resemblance was impossible to ignore now. The investor had seen it. He had seen it clearly. And investors do not overlook risk. The elevator reached the lobby with a soft hum. The doors opened to polished stone, revolving glass doors, and the steady rhythm of midtown foot traffic beyond. Zuri stepped out first. The twins followed. Richard hesitated again, that pattern still clinging to him, then stepped out too. The lobby felt different from earlier. Earlier, it had been the entry point to a deal. Now it felt like the exit point of denial. Zuri paused near the revolving doors. She knelt slightly to adjust Abigail's hair, smoothing one curl behind her ear. "Hold hands," she reminded them gently. Felicity obeyed, though her eyes remained fixed on Richard. He stood a few feet away, close enough to speak, close enough to change something. The city outside moved with its usual urgency. Yellow taxis, horns in the distance, a hot dog cart sending up the faint scent of onions and mustard. Life continued. Zuri rose to her full height and finally faced him. There was no anger in her posture, only fatigue. "I didn't come here to ruin anything," she said quietly. "I came because they started asking questions I couldn't answer anymore." Richard swallowed. "I didn't know," he said. It sounded thin, even to him. "You didn't try to," she replied. The words weren't sharp. They were steady. Felicity tugged lightly on Zuri's coat. "Mommy," she whispered, loud enough for Richard to hear, "is he coming with us?" That question settled into the space between them like something fragile. Richard's throat tightened. He took one step forward, then stopped. The weight of expectation, from the investor, from the boardroom, from markets that tracked his decisions, pressed against his shoulders. But the weight of those two small voices pressed somewhere deeper. Abigail looked at him with quiet patience. No accusation, just waiting. Richard opened his mouth again. "Zuri," he began. He didn't finish, because finishing meant choosing. Zuri nodded once, understanding more than he said. "We live in Harlem," she offered calmly. "Same apartment." Not an invitation, not a plea. Information. The revolving doors spun once as a group of tourists exited. Cold air brushed through the lobby. Felicity lifted her hand. "Bye," she said softly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't final. Just a child's goodbye. Richard felt something fracture inside him, not loudly, not visibly, but enough that standing upright felt different. He almost called her name, almost stepped forward, almost reached for the bracelet to hand it back. But hesitation is a habit that grows roots. Zuri guided the twins toward the doors. The sunlight caught their curls as they stepped onto the sidewalk. Richard stood frozen inside the lobby of the tower he had built his identity around. Through the glass, he watched them pause at the corner. Felicity turned around one last time and waved. Abigail mirrored her. Zuri did not. She kept walking. The city swallowed them quickly. Taxis passing, pedestrians weaving, the rhythm of New York uninterrupted. Richard remained where he was. Boardroom postponed. Investor watching from somewhere unseen. Opportunity suspended. He looked down at the bracelet in his hand. It felt heavier now, not because of metal, because of meaning. He could still walk back upstairs, still salvage the meeting, still pretend this moment would wait politely. But something told him it wouldn't, because silence doesn't disappear. It compounds. And as the lobby noise rose back to normal volume, as receptionists resumed their greetings and security scanned badges without curiosity, Richard felt the first real crack in the version of himself he had carefully constructed. He had mastered expansion. He had mastered growth. He had mastered control. But he had never mastered consequence. And as the revolving doors spun again, erasing the last visible trace of Zuri, Felicity, and Abigail from his immediate reach, one truth settled heavily in his chest. But ambition never warned him that silence could cost more than any contract. Before there were glass towers and postponed meetings, before little sneakers blinked inside quiet elevators, there was music and summer, the kind of New York summer that wraps around you like a warm hand and refuses to let go. 5 years earlier, Greenwich Village pulsed differently at night. Streetlights glowed gold against brownstone walls, and laughter spilled from open cafe doors. The sidewalks were crowded but unhurried. Tourists with cameras, couples with linked arms, artists with paint still under their nails. And somewhere between Bleecker Street and a corner where a hot dog vendor argued playfully with a cab driver, a saxophone began to sing, not politely, not softly. It rose full and rich into the evening air, the sound of Harlem carried downtown by a man who had probably played in churches and subway tunnels, maybe even at weddings where someone's auntie cried too loudly during the vows. Zuri stopped walking when she heard it. Music did that to her. She had grown up on Sunday choirs that shook stained glass windows, on cookouts in Brooklyn where someone always brought a speaker and someone else always tried to outsing it. Rhythm lived in her bones. She closed her eyes for just a second. Let it settle. When she opened them again, she noticed him. Richard wasn't dancing. He wasn't swaying. He was watching the musician like he was studying a business strategy, brows slightly furrowed, posture straight, hands tucked into the pockets of tailored slacks that probably cost more than her rent. He looked slightly out of place, not uncomfortable, just structured. The music curved around him anyway. Zuri smiled to herself, and that's when it happened. A tourist bumped her elbow. Her plastic cup tilted, and a splash of sweet iced tea landed directly on the sleeve of Richard's crisp white shirt. Silence, just for a beat. Richard looked down at the spreading stain. Zuri gasped. "Oh my goodness, I am so sorry." The saxophone didn't stop. The crowd didn't stop. But for them, everything paused. Richard examined his sleeve carefully. Then he looked up at her. His expression held for a moment, serious, calculating, and then he laughed. Not politely, not stiffly, genuinely. "Well," he said, glancing at the musician, "I suppose that's what I get for standing too close to real life." Zuri blinked. "That's one way to look at it," she replied, trying not to laugh herself. "Most people would be upset." "Most people don't wear white shirts in July," he answered. She tilted her head. "So, this is your fault?" "I'm willing to take partial responsibility." That made her laugh, soft at first, then fuller. The saxophone shifted into a brighter tune. A few people clapped in rhythm. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a neatly folded handkerchief, the kind most men only carry for show. He dabbed at the stain carefully. Zuri watched him for a second longer than necessary. "You're not from around here," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "What gives me away?" "The handkerchief," she answered without hesitation. He glanced at it, then back at her. "And you are?" "Born and raised Greenwich Village." "Brooklyn," she corrected, smiling. "But this is my favorite corner." He nodded slowly, taking that in like information he intended to keep. The saxophone player hit a high note that lingered in the air. Richard turned slightly toward the sound. "He's good. He's better than good," Zuri said. "He's telling a story." Richard looked at her again, really looked this time. "And what's the story?" he asked. She hesitated, then shrugged gently. "That even if the rent's high and the train's late and your boss doesn't see your worth, you can still make something beautiful." Richard's expression softened. "That's optimistic." "It's realistic," she replied. A breeze drifted through the street, carrying the faint scent of pizza and something fried. The saxophone eased into a slower melody now. Richard stepped slightly closer so they could hear each other over the crowd. "I'm Richard," he said. "Zuri." He repeated it once, quietly, as if testing the sound. "Zuri." The way he said it made her stomach flip just slightly, the smallest, most unexpected reaction. "You come here often?" he asked. She laughed. "Did you just use that line in 2021? Is it outdated?" "Very." He grinned. "Then I'll try again. Would you mind explaining what I'm missing in this song?" She studied him carefully. Most men she met either tried too hard or not at all. He seemed curious. "That depends," she said. "Are you listening with your ears or your ego?" He paused, then nodded once. "Fair question." The musician leaned into a riff that made a small group nearby cheer. Without overthinking it, Richard extended his hand. "Teach me," he said. Zuri hesitated just long enough to make him wonder. Then she placed her hand in his. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was warm, grounded, human. They didn't dance exactly, just swayed a little, shifting weight in time with the music. Richard's movements were stiff at first. Zuri noticed. "You're counting," she teased. "I like structure. You can't structure jazz. Watch me try." She shook her head, smiling. The music swelled again, the saxophone bending notes like they were made of rubber. Richard's shoulders loosened, just slightly, and when he stopped counting and started feeling, Zuri saw it. The sincerity, the hunger beneath the polish. This wasn't just a man chasing money. This was a man who wanted to understand the room he was standing in. The song ended to scattered applause. Richard didn't let go of her hand immediately. Neither did she. The night hummed around them. Taxis passing, laughter echoing from a nearby rooftop, someone arguing about the Yankees down the block. "Coffee?" he asked. "It's 10 at night. Pizza?" She pretended to consider. "Only if you admit the tea spill was destiny." He smiled slowly. "I believe in calculated risk," he said. "Wrong answer," she replied, stepping back slightly. "Try again." He took a breath. "Maybe," he said carefully. "Some things aren't meant to be calculated." Zuri studied him for a second longer. Then she nodded. "Pizza," she said. They began walking together, blending into the rhythm of the village. The saxophone started up again behind them, softer now, like a blessing trailing after two strangers who didn't yet understand what they were beginning. Because sometimes attraction is loud, sometimes it's reckless, and sometimes it's just two people laughing over a spilled drink while music plays in the background. Some love stories don't knock, they play music. The pizza place on Carmine Street had fluorescent menus and scratch tables, the kind of spot where the slices were bigger than the plates and nobody cared how late it was. Zuri folded her slice in half the way she always did. Richard noticed. "Is that required?" he asked. "In New York? Yes," she said. "You fold, or you expose yourself as an outsider." He studied his own slice carefully, then attempted the fold. It collapsed awkwardly. She laughed. "Too tight," she said. "You're overthinking it." "That's a theme with me, apparently." She took a bite, sauce brushing the corner of her mouth. He handed her a napkin without saying a word. She paused. "See," she said softly, dabbing her lip. "You do pay attention." He shrugged. "Details matter." She looked at him for a second longer than usual. "Why are you really here tonight?" she asked. He didn't deflect. "Scouting properties," he said. "Investment opportunities." "Ah," she nodded. "Of course. That disappoints you?" "It doesn't surprise me." He leaned back slightly. "You think I only see buildings when I walk through neighborhoods? And do you?" she asked. He hesitated. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But tonight I saw music first." That answer lingered between them. Outside, the village buzzed, skateboard wheels clacking over pavement, someone arguing about subway delays, a couple laughing too loudly at a joke that probably wasn't that funny. They finished their slices slowly, neither in a rush. When they stepped back onto the street, the night had deepened. The air cooled just enough to make walking comfortable. "Harlem, tomorrow?" Richard asked as they stood near the curb. She blinked. "You move fast. I like efficiency." "This isn't a merger," she said. He smiled. "I'm aware." She studied him carefully. He wasn't slick. He wasn't pushing. He just looked interested. "There's a coffee spot on Lenox," she said finally. "Late mornings are quieter." "I'll be there." The next day, Harlem felt different from Greenwich Village. Not better, not worse, just different in rhythm. The sidewalks moved with intention. Elderly men played chess near the park. A woman argued passionately into her phone while holding 2 grocery bags. Gospel music drifted faintly from a church with open doors. Zuri arrived first. She liked arriving first. Control felt comfortable. Richard approached 5 minutes later, wearing a lighter jacket this time. No white shirt. Learning, she noted. He glanced down at himself. Adaptive strategy. She rolled her eyes and led him inside. The cafe smelled like roasted beans and cinnamon. Framed photos of local artists lined the walls. A small chalkboard announced open mic night. Richard took it in quietly. "You grew up here?" he asked. "Not far," she said. "Brooklyn, technically. But Harlem always felt like home." He nodded, absorbing more than he said. They sat by the window. "Tell me something," she said. "What's the end goal?" "For the investment?" he asked. "For you." He leaned back, considering. "Expansion," he said. "Global reach, influence, stability. And after that?" He frowned slightly. "After that?" She stirred her coffee slowly. "You ever think about what it's all for?" He looked out the window for a second. "My father believed security came from achievement," he said carefully. "Build enough, and nothing can shake you." "And do you believe that?" He looked back at her. "I'm still deciding." She smiled faintly. They talked for 2 hours. About childhood, about Sunday dinners, about ambition and faith and the strange pressure of being told you have potential your whole life. At one point, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then placed it face down. She noticed. Important? She asked. It can wait, he said. That choice didn't go unnoticed. Days folded into weeks. They walked across the Brooklyn Bridge one evening, the skyline glowing like something sacred behind them. Tourists snapped photos. Street vendors sold water for triple the price. Richard rested his arms on the railing, looking out over the water. It's strange, he said. What is? I've negotiated deals worth millions standing in rooms smaller than this sidewalk, but this feels bigger. She smiled gently. Because this isn't about winning. He nodded slowly. They learned each other's rhythms. She liked late-night talks. He liked early mornings. She teased him for checking emails at brunch. He teased her for correcting his pronunciation of neighborhood names. Say it again. She laughed once as they stood near 125th Street. Harlem, he tried. She shook her head. No, Harlem, he repeated, slower. Better. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered, just briefly, yes. I'll send it tonight. He hung up. She didn't comment immediately, but she filed it away. Weeks passed. He met her mother once, briefly, at a Sunday gathering where music filled the apartment and someone insisted he try a second plate of food. He was polite, respectful, slightly overwhelmed. Zuri watched carefully. He tried. That mattered. But so did the buzzing phone. It buzzed during dinners, during walks, during moments when she wanted him fully present. He always returned to her afterward. Apologetic, sincere, but distracted. One evening, sitting on her small balcony while the city hummed below, she asked quietly, Do you ever stop? He leaned back in the chair. When I'm with you, he said. She studied his face, wanted to believe it fully, and maybe she did, because love often chooses hope over warning signs. They were different. That was clear. She carried community in her voice. He carried ambition in his posture. But difference isn't division. Not at first. At first, it feels like balance. Until it doesn't. Because love doesn't compete with ambition. Until it has to. By the end of that summer, the city felt smaller when they were together. Not physically. Emotionally. They had built routines without announcing them as routines. Thursday nights were theirs. Even if Richard had meetings stretching into the evening, he would find his way downtown or uptown or across a bridge to wherever Zuri was waiting. Sometimes it was her apartment in Brooklyn, windows open, music drifting low from her speaker. Sometimes it was a quiet bench in Riverside Park, the Hudson moving steady beside them. He learned how she took her tea, strong with honey. She learned that he read contracts twice, even when he trusted the people signing them. They moved in sync more often than not. And that's what made the shift subtle. The first time Richard mentioned London, it sounded temporary. 3 months, he said, scrolling through flight details on his phone. Expansion talks. It's a good opportunity. They were sitting on her couch, shoes kicked off, takeout containers half finished on the coffee table. Zuri nodded slowly. 3 months, she repeated. He looked up. I'll fly back on weekends if I can. If I can. She caught the phrase, but she didn't challenge it. Ambition had always been part of him. It wasn't new. It wasn't hidden. It was stitched into the way he spoke about the future. When do you leave? She asked. 2 weeks. 2 weeks felt manageable. 2 weeks felt survivable. They made the most of those days. Walks through Central Park. Late-night conversations about where life might take them. One evening, standing under streetlights in the village where they first met, Richard pulled her close and said quietly, I don't want distance to change this. She searched his face. Then don't let it, she said. He kissed her forehead gently. I won't. The morning of his departure, the sky over JFK was pale and undecided. Zuri stood beside him near the drop-off lane, the sound of rolling suitcases and departure announcements blending into a low hum. You'll call when you land? She asked. Of course. And when you wake up? He smiled faintly. Yes. She tried to memorize the way he looked at her in that moment, steady, confident, certain of his own promises. He touched her cheek. 3 months, he repeated. She nodded. 3 months. When he walked through security, he turned once and waved. She waved back. And for a moment, It felt like a movie scene. Temporary separation, dramatic but brief. The first week passed easily. He called from his hotel room, tired but enthusiastic. Spoke about meetings, investors, potential contracts. The time difference made conversations shorter, but they still happened. The second week grew busier. He texted more than he called. Long day. Meetings ran late. Talk tomorrow. She told herself it was adjustment. The third week, she noticed something else. She was tired. More than usual. She blamed work at first. Late nights at her firm. Stress. City life. But when morning sickness arrived quietly, without announcement, she paused. She stood alone in her bathroom, staring at the small box resting on the sink. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear exactly, from awareness. She took the test. Waited. The silence in that tiny room felt louder than traffic outside. 2 lines. Clear. Unmistakable. She sat on the edge of the tub for a long moment. Breathing. Not panicking. Just absorbing. Okay, she whispered to herself. She reached for her phone. Called Richard. It rang. And rang. Voicemail. She tried again an hour later. Voicemail. She sent a message. Call me when you can. Hours passed. The time difference stretched like a barrier. When he finally texted back, it was brief. In meetings all day. Exhausted. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. She stared at the word. Tomorrow felt far. The next day she called again. No answer. She told herself not to assume, not to jump. Ambition demanded time. She knew that. But pregnancy did not pause for business schedules. Days blurred into weeks. 3 months extended into 4. Negotiations complicated. Need more time here. Almost done. She didn't tell him over text. She refused to reduce something this large to a message bubble. She waited for a call that lasted more than 5 minutes. It didn't come. The calls grew shorter, less frequent, sometimes missed entirely. One evening, standing in her kitchen while the smell of sautéed onions filled the apartment, she dialed again. Voicemail. Her voice cracked slightly when she left the message. Richard, we need to talk. No accusation, just urgency. He replied hours later. Board presentation tomorrow, big one. I'll call after. He didn't. Weeks passed. Her body changed. Subtle at first, then undeniable. Doctor appointments alone. Forms filled alone. Waiting rooms alone. She sat once in a clinic chair, hands resting on her stomach, staring at a framed photo on the wall that showed a smiling couple holding a newborn. She felt strong, but strength and loneliness can coexist. She tried again. Call during what should have been his early morning. Voicemail. She didn't leave a message this time. She just stared at the screen until it went dark. In the quiet of her apartment that night, she whispered the truth out loud. There are 2, the doctor had said it gently. Twins. She pressed her hands against her stomach and laughed once, a soft, incredulous sound. 2. She reached for her phone again. Typed. Deleted. Typed again. Finally she wrote. We're having twins. She stared at the message for a long time before hitting send. The status showed. Delivered. No response. Hours passed. Then, a day. Then another. Silence. She didn't know if he saw it. She didn't know if he ignored it. She only knew that she was stepping into something irreversible. Alone. And sometimes the test shows 2 lines. But the phone shows none. The first night Felicity cried at 2:13 a.m. The second night it was Abigail. By the third night, Zuri stopped checking the clock. Sleep became something theoretical, a memory of how her body used to feel when it belonged to only her. The Harlem apartment wasn't large. 1 bedroom, a living room that had slowly transformed into a nursery with 2 bassinets positioned side by side like twin promises. The radiator clanged in winter. The upstairs neighbor paced in heavy footsteps past midnight. Sirens hummed through Lenox Avenue at unpredictable hours. Life did not lower its volume just because she had newborns. Zuri learned to move quietly anyway. She would lift Felicity first, always Felicity first, because Felicity cried louder. Abigail's cry was softer, almost polite. She'd warm a bottle in the dim kitchen light, rocking one baby against her shoulder while the other waited in the bassinet, tiny fists curling and uncurling. There was no audience, no applause, Just repetition. Feed. Burp. Change. Soothe. Repeat. Some nights she sat on the edge of the couch at 3 a.m., both babies finally asleep against her chest, her back aching, her eyes burning. And she would allow herself one deep breath. Just one. Then she'd whisper, "We're okay." Not as reassurance, as commitment. During the day, she returned to work sooner than most people advised. The law firm didn't reduce its expectations because she was a mother now. Contracts still needed reviewing. Clients still demanded precision. She mastered efficiency, pumped milk between conference calls, reviewed briefs while one twin napped and the other kicked gently in a portable crib beside her desk at home. She didn't complain, not because it wasn't hard, because complaining would have required energy she didn't have. On Sundays, she dressed the twins in matching outfits, soft cotton dresses in the summer, tiny sweaters in the winter, and walked them to church 3 blocks away. The sanctuary welcomed her without spectacle. Women pressed folded notes into her hand with Bible verses written in careful ink. Someone always held one baby while she adjusted the other. A choir rehearsal in the background would soften whatever exhaustion clung to her shoulders. No one pitied her. That mattered. They simply included her. After service, in the fellowship hall downstairs, she balanced a paper plate of food while bouncing one twin on her hip and keeping an eye on the other rolling on a blanket. "You're strong," someone said once. Zuri smiled politely. She didn't feel strong. She felt responsible. There's a difference. Strong implies choice. Responsible implies necessity. On weekdays, she walked the twins in a double stroller through Marcus Garvey Park, nodding to familiar faces. Elderly men played dominoes. Teenagers practiced dance routines near the fountain. A vendor sold sliced mango with chili powder sprinkled carefully on top. Life moved around her, not pausing, not waiting, and she moved with it. As the girls grew older, night feedings turned into bedtime stories. The bassinets became twin beds squeezed into the corner of her bedroom. She taught them how to brush their teeth in sync, how to clean up their toys before dinner, how to say please and thank you without being prompted. She didn't speak about Richard often, not because she was hiding him, because she refused to let absence define their home. When Felicity asked at 3 years old, "Where's my daddy?" Zuri knelt down to eye level. "He lives far away," she said carefully. "Does he know me?" Abigail asked softly. Zuri paused. "Yes," she answered, because at that point, she still believed he would call. Time moved. The twins started preschool at a community center nearby. Zuri stood outside the classroom door the first morning longer than necessary, listening to their laughter blend with other children's voices. She had learned how to be 2 parents in one body, discipline and tenderness, structure and softness. She paid bills on time, negotiated salary increases without apology, carried groceries up 3 flights of stairs without asking for help. And on rare nights when both girls slept through until morning, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and allowed herself to feel the weight of it all. The quiet, the solitude, the missing piece she refused to name as broken. She did not chase him, did not beg, did not send message after message into silence. There is dignity in restraint. She focused instead on building savings, building stability, building daughters who laughed loudly and hugged tightly and believed they were loved, because they were. When the twins turned 5, they insisted on a birthday party in the park. Balloons tied to a picnic table. Cupcakes slightly tilted from the subway ride. A borrowed speaker playing children's songs too loudly. Felicity ran in circles. Abigail held Zuri's hand before joining her sister. "Mommy," Felicity said suddenly, breathless, "are you tired?" Zuri looked at her. "Yes," she said honestly. "Why?" She crouched down. "Because I do a lot." Abigail frowned thoughtfully. "Like superheroes?" Zuri smiled slowly. "Something like that. But here's what people misunderstand about strength. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wait for validation. It wakes up when the baby cries. It shows up to work when you'd rather sleep. It answers hard questions with steady eyes. It carries 2 backpacks and 2 small hands without dropping either." Zuri didn't think of herself as extraordinary. She thought of herself as necessary. And sometimes that's enough. Strength isn't loud. It just keeps going. While Zuri learned the rhythm of midnight feedings and preschool drop-offs, Richard learned the rhythm of expansion. London turned into Frankfurt, Frankfurt into Singapore, Singapore back to Manhattan. Airports blurred together. Boardrooms changed accents. Numbers grew larger. So did expectations. By the time Felicity and Abigail were learning to tie their shoes, Richard had moved into a corner office inside a glass tower overlooking Midtown. Floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture, a desk so polished it reflected the skyline. Success by every external measure. His assistant filtered calls with precision. Investors requested private dinners. Industry magazines quoted him on leadership and foresight. He spoke confidently about long-term vision, about sustainability, about legacy. That word, legacy, came easily in professional settings, harder in private ones. The investor who would later stand beside him in that elevator had begun applying pressure years earlier. Growth requires risk, the investor had said during one meeting, hands folded calmly on the table. Richard nodded. I'm aware. Risk also reveals character, the investor replied. At the time, Richard interpreted that as financial discipline. He didn't realize the comment carried a broader meaning. His days were tightly scheduled. Conference calls at sunrise, strategy meetings by noon, evenings often reserved for networking events where laughter felt slightly rehearsed and glasses clinked over conversations about acquisition. There were moments, small ones, when something quieter surfaced. One late evening, long after most of the building had emptied, Richard remained alone at his desk reviewing documents. The city outside glittered with movement. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted in a way that sleep didn't fix. He opened a lower drawer, searching for a contract file. Instead, he found an envelope. Old, unlabeled. Inside was a photo. He had forgotten it was there. The picture showed him and Zuri standing near the Brooklyn Bridge, her head tilted slightly toward him, wind lifting her hair just enough to make the moment look unplanned. He remembered that night clearly. The way she laughed when he mispronounced Harlem. The way she looked at him when he admitted he wasn't sure what everything was for. He stared at the photo longer than necessary. Then longer still. His phone buzzed. He flipped it face down. But he didn't put the photo away immediately. There was no dramatic regret. No sudden collapse of certainty. Just a faint discomfort. A question he didn't let himself finish. He slid the photo back into the envelope and closed the drawer. Work resumed, yet over the next few months interruptions came in subtle ways. At a charity gala downtown, while discussing an upcoming merger, he overheard someone mention Zuri's name. He turned instinctively. The conversation wasn't about him. It was about a rising attorney in Harlem known for her tenacity and courtroom precision. That young woman with the twins, someone said casually. Impressive. Twins. The word passed through him like a quiet echo. He didn't approach. Didn't ask for details. He simply carried the information home with him. Later that night, standing alone in his apartment overlooking Central Park, he poured a glass of water and stared out the window. Twins. He replayed old messages in his mind. The last text she sent. He remembered seeing it. He remembered the timing, during a critical negotiation overseas. He had told himself he would respond when things settled. Things never settled. He didn't delete the message. He just didn't answer it. There is a difference. One implies intention. The other, avoidance. The merger pressure intensified. Board members demanded projections. The investor requested weekly updates. Personal distractions must be minimized, the investor said once during a strategy session. Richard nodded automatically. But the phrase lingered longer than it should have. Personal distractions. He found himself wondering whether silence qualified as distraction or denial. One afternoon he caught his reflection in the glass wall of his office. Tailored suit, controlled posture, confident expression. He looked composed, successful, untouchable. But reflections are honest in ways meetings are not. They don't clap. They don't praise. They just show you what's there. He opened the drawer again, pulled out the photo. This time, he studied Zuri's face more carefully. She had looked hopeful, certain. He traced the edge of the photo lightly with his thumb. Then his phone buzzed again. The investor's name flashed across the screen. Ready for tomorrow? The investor asked when Richard answered. Of course. Good, the investor replied. We're close. Don't lose focus now. Don't lose focus. Richard glanced down at the photo still resting on his desk. Focus had always meant forward, never backward. He ended the call, placed the photo back into the drawer, closed it firmly. But something had shifted, not loudly, not enough to derail him, just enough to introduce doubt. Later that week, during a strategy lunch in Midtown, he overheard another fragment of conversation behind him. Those twins look just like... The sentence cut off when the speaker noticed Richard nearby. He pretended not to notice, finished his meal, paid the bill, returned to his office. But the fragment followed him. Look just like... He sat at his desk long after sunset, the skyline reflected in the darkened glass. And for the first time in years, ambition felt incomplete. Not wrong, just incomplete. Because expansion can widen your reach. It cannot erase what you left untouched. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. What if the life he left didn't disappear? The day Zuri learned about the investors' meeting, it wasn't dramatic. No thunderclap, no whispered tip. Just information passing through ordinary channels. She was leaving the courthouse downtown, briefcase balanced against her hip, when she noticed a financial news alert scrolling across a digital screen near the subway entrance. Richard's company, major merger. Final negotiations scheduled at a Midtown tower. She didn't stop walking immediately, but her steps slowed. She read it again. Date, time, location, clear, public. The city moved around her, commuters descending into the subway, a street vendor calling out lunch specials, a taxi honking impatiently at a delivery truck. Ordinary day, extraordinary timing. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not shaking, not overwhelmed, just calculating. 5 years had passed. 5 years of unanswered calls. 5 years of raising daughters who asked careful questions. She had never taken him to court, never filed for support, never sent threatening messages, not because she didn't have grounds, because she wanted something different. Acknowledgement. That word had grown quietly in her over time. Not money, not revenge. Acknowledgement. She rode the subway back to Harlem with steady posture, her reflection faintly visible in the train window. The train screeched into 125th Street. She climbed the stairs into sunlight and walked home past the familiar storefronts, the beauty supply shop, the corner deli, the barber shop where laughter spilled onto the sidewalk. Her apartment greeted her with quiet warmth. Felicity and Abigail were sprawled on the living room floor coloring superheroes into existence. "Mommy," Felicity announced without looking up. "We made capes." Abigail held up a drawing carefully. "Mine flies higher," she said softly. Zuri smiled. "Both of you fly high," she replied. She set her briefcase down, sat beside them, watched them for a moment. 2 lives that existed because she chose not to crumble. She reached into a small wooden box on the shelf above the television. The bracelet lay there, worn leather, faded crest. She had found it years earlier tucked inside a jacket pocket he left behind at her apartment the night before leaving for London. He must have thought he lost it in the rush. She had kept it, not as a shrine, as evidence. Felicity noticed the bracelet in her hand. "What's that?" she asked. "Something important," Zuri said gently. "Is it Daddy's?" Abigail asked. Zuri didn't flinch at the word anymore. "Yes," she answered. They looked at each other, then back at her. "Does he know about us?" Felicity asked. Zuri took a slow breath. "I told him," she said. "But sometimes grown-ups don't know how to answer." Abigail frowned slightly. "Is he scared?" The question lingered. "Maybe," Zuri replied honestly. She wasn't here to turn their father into a villain. Children build identity from what they're told about their parents. She refused to poison that foundation. That evening, after dinner and baths and bedtime stories, she sat alone at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She searched the building listed in the article, looked at photos of the lobby, the elevators, the corporate floors, glass and steel. Impressive, impersonal. She closed the laptop slowly. This wasn't about spectacle. It wasn't about embarrassment. It was about collision. Timing mattered. He had avoided calls, ignored messages, expanded his world beyond reach. Fine. Then she would step into his. The morning of the meeting arrived clear and cool. She dressed carefully, not extravagantly, not casually, professional, steady. She braided the twins' hair neatly, choosing matching dresses without overthinking it. "Where are we going?" Felicity asked. "To see someone," Zuri said. "Is it Daddy?" Abigail asked quietly. Zuri paused. "Yes." The word settled gently between them. Neither girl reacted dramatically. Children accept truths when they're presented without fear. "Will he like us?" Felicity asked. Zuri knelt in front of them. "He will have to decide who he wants to be," she said softly. "But you don't have to prove anything." Abigail reached for the bracelet. "Can I hold it?" Zuri nodded. "That's why we're bringing it." The subway ride downtown felt slower than usual. Zuri held the pole with one hand and Abigail's shoulder with the other. Felicity watched the passing stations with wide eyes. "Is he tall?" she asked. "Yes," Zuri said. "Does he laugh?" Abigail asked. "He used to," Zuri answered. The train emerged into brighter light as it approached Midtown. Zuri's heartbeat remained steady, not racing, not fragile. She wasn't doing this to shock him. She was doing this because waiting had ended. They exited the station and walked toward the tower. Glass rose high above them, reflecting the sky. Felicity looked up. "Wow," she whispered. Zuri squeezed her hand gently. Inside the lobby, security scanned visitors calmly. Business attire blended with hurried footsteps. Zuri approached the desk. "We're here for the merger meeting," she said evenly. The guard checked a list. "Yes, ma'am." "Elevator bank 3. Professional courtesy. No suspicion." She led the twins toward the elevators. The doors opened. They stepped inside, and as the elevator doors began to close, Zuri met Richard's eyes for the first time in 5 years. Truth doesn't shout. It waits. The boardroom smelled like polished wood and quiet expectation. Long glass table. Leather chairs aligned with precision. Screens mounted on the wall displaying charts that projected growth in confident blue lines. When Richard entered, the room shifted, not dramatically, just enough. Conversations paused, eyes lifted. The investor remained seated at the head of the table, hands folded calmly, as if nothing in the last 20 minutes had altered the day's agenda. But something had. Richard closed the door behind him. The faint click echoed louder than it should have. He remained standing for a moment instead of taking his usual seat. No one commented. The investor studied him carefully. "Shall we proceed?" the investor asked evenly. Richard nodded. Yes. The presentation began. Numbers filled the screen. Projections, timelines, expansion models stretching into international markets. Richard spoke clearly at first. His voice carried authority, practiced, measured. He outlined strategy with the confidence of a man who had spent years building toward this moment. But midway through the third slide, his gaze drifted, just slightly, toward the reflection in the glass wall. He didn't see charts there. He saw 2 small figures standing in an elevator. "Richard," the investor prompted gently. He blinked. "Yes." He continued. "Revenue forecasts, market penetration, shareholder value." Each word left his mouth with technical precision, but without its usual conviction. The investor leaned back slowly. "Before we move forward," he said, interrupting the slide progression, "there appears to be a matter that requires clarification." The room tightened. Richard didn't pretend not to understand. "This is a personal issue," he said. The investor's expression remained composed. "Personal matters," he replied, "have a way of becoming public. No accusation, just truth." Several board members shifted in their seats. Richard felt heat gather behind his collar again. The same sensation from the hallway earlier. "There is nothing illegal," he said firmly. "I didn't suggest there was," the investor replied. "I am asking whether there is anything unresolved that could compromise this company's stability." There it was. Not fatherhood, not love. Stability. Richard's jaw tightened. "My personal life does not affect my professional judgment." The investor held his gaze. "Are you certain?" Silence stretched across the table. Richard had always prided himself on being prepared. He anticipated objections before they surfaced. He built contingencies into every deal. He had not built one for this. One of the board members cleared his throat. "Are the children yours?" he asked quietly. Direct, uncomfortable, necessary. Richard felt the weight of every eye in the room. He thought about denial. It had come easily earlier. But denial under fluorescent lighting in front of financial stakeholders felt different. They might be, he said finally. Not loud, not weak, honest. The room absorbed the answer. The investor nodded once. And if they are? Richard exhaled slowly. Then I will handle it. How? The investor asked. That question carried more weight than any revenue projection. How? Richard had answers for expansion into Asia, for restructuring debt, for negotiating hostile bids. But how do you handle 5 years of silence? I will take responsibility, he said. The words felt unfamiliar. The investor's eyes sharpened slightly. Responsibility, he repeated. Define that. The room was no longer evaluating quarterly returns. It was evaluating character. Richard's mind raced. He could commit financially. He could establish legal clarity. He could protect the company from reputational risk. But none of those addressed the deeper issue. They deserve acknowledgement, he said quietly. The board members exchanged glances. The investor did not look surprised. Do they? He asked. Richard met his gaze. Yes. That single word shifted the air. The investor folded his hands on the table. You built this company on the idea that integrity compounds, he said. That trust builds equity. Richard nodded slowly. I did. Then understand this, the investor continued. Integrity does not stop at the office door. The room remained silent. Richard felt something inside him give way, not collapse, not surrender, but recognition. For years he had separated compartments. Business here, personal there, growth forward, history behind. Now the compartments had collided. The investor leaned forward slightly. If this becomes a headline, he said calmly, the question will not be about your valuation. Richard's throat tightened. It will be about who you are. The weight of that statement settled heavily. He imagined headlines, speculation, whispers, but deeper than that. He imagined Felicity asking why he didn't claim her. He imagined Abigail offering him a juice box in an elevator because she sensed he was thirsty. The boardroom felt smaller. What are you asking of me? Richard said quietly. The investor held his gaze steadily. I'm asking whether you intend to be the man you claim to be. No raised voice, no threat, just clarity. Richard glanced around the table. Some faces looked concerned, some skeptical, none indifferent. Reputation was fragile currency, and he had spent years building his. The investor leaned back again. We can postpone the merger, he said. Markets recover. Trust is harder. Postpone. The word echoed differently now. Earlier, it had meant delay. Now it meant choice. Richard closed the presentation on the screen. The charts disappeared, leaving only reflection in the glass wall. He saw himself standing there, suit immaculate, posture trained, and beneath that, something less certain. He swallowed. I will address this, he said. Immediately. The investor nodded once. That would be wise. The meeting adjourned without applause, without celebration, without resolution. As board members filed out quietly, Richard remained seated, alone at the long table. The skyline shimmered outside, indifferent to human complication. He placed both hands flat against the glass surface and stared at his own reflection. All the years of expansion, all the nights spent perfecting strategy, all the sacrifices justified as necessary. And now, two small voices had introduced a variable he could not quantify. He stood slowly, walked toward the window. Far below, midtown traffic moved without hesitation. Life rarely pauses for moral clarity, but sometimes it demands it. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to escape, to decide, because success measures profit, but identity measures something else entirely. And as he reached for the door handle to leave the boardroom, to step out of performance and into consequence, one question pressed harder than any financial risk he had ever taken. What's $1 billion worth? If it costs you your name? By the time Richard reached the lobby, the glass doors were already spinning. Zuri stood just outside on the sidewalk, one hand holding Felicity's, the other resting lightly on Abigail's shoulder. Midtown noise wrapped around them, taxis braking sharply, a delivery truck unloading crates, a street vendor calling out lunch specials in a practiced rhythm. New York did not care about personal reckonings. It kept moving. Richard paused just inside the revolving doors. For a moment, just a moment, he considered letting them walk. He could claim urgency, responsibility upstairs, a rescheduled meeting. But something inside him had shifted in that boardroom. And he knew it. He pushed through the doors. Cold air hit his face. Zuri. She didn't turn immediately, not out of indifference, out of caution. Felicity looked back first. "Mommy, he's coming," she said. Zuri exhaled softly before facing him. There was no anger in her expression, but there was history. "What do you want, Richard?" she asked. Direct, not hostile, just honest. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so it didn't spill into the sidewalk traffic. "I need to understand," he said. "Understand what?" she replied. "Why now?" Her eyebrows lifted slightly. 5 years wasn't enough time. The question didn't cut. It revealed. He ran a hand through his hair, an old nervous habit he thought he had outgrown. "I didn't know how to respond," he said. "That's different from not responding," she answered. Silence hovered between them. Not heavy, just real. Felicity tugged gently at his pant leg. "Are you our daddy?" she asked again, softer this time. Richard crouched slowly to eye level. The sidewalk blurred around him, polished shoes stepping past, a woman talking loudly into her headset, a bus exhaling air at the curb. He looked at them. Really looked. "I might be," he said carefully. "Why don't you know?" Abigail asked. He swallowed. "Because sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," he said. Zuri watched him closely, measured his tone, his posture, his willingness. She didn't interrupt. "You never came," Felicity added, her voice not accusing, just factual. Richard stood again. The height difference felt symbolic now. "I was building something," he said quietly. Zuri nodded once. "I know." That surprised him. "You know?" "Yes," she said. "I watched the articles, the interviews, the expansion." He felt exposed in a way no press conference had ever made him feel. "And you never called again?" he asked. "I did," she replied calmly, "until I realized silence was your answer." That landed, not as blame, as reality. The city's rhythm pressed in around them. Car horns, distant sirens, fragments of conversations. "Why didn't you file anything?" he asked. She tilted her head slightly. "For money," she said. He didn't answer. She continued, "I never wanted your money." Felicity looked between them, confused. "Money is green paper," she announced helpfully. Abigail nodded in agreement. Zuri smiled faintly at that, then returned her focus to Richard. "I wanted acknowledgement," she said, not louder, clearer. He stared at her. "You could have forced it," he said. "Yes," she replied, "but forced acknowledgement isn't real." The wind lifted the ends of her braids slightly. She didn't look fragile. She looked tired of carrying something alone. "They deserve to know who they come from," she added. "They know who they come from," he said defensively. Her eyes sharpened just a little. "They know who I am," she corrected. That distinction hung between them. Richard glanced down at the twins. They stood patiently, absorbing words without fully grasping weight. "Did you plan this?" he asked quietly. She didn't deny it. "I knew about the meeting," she said. "I knew you wouldn't ignore me in front of your biggest investor." There was no triumph in her voice, only strategy. "You used that," he said. "I used access," she corrected gently. "You've been unreachable." He inhaled slowly. The truth of that pressed deeper than accusation ever could. "I'm not here to embarrass you," she continued. "If I wanted to do that, I would have chosen a camera crew instead of an elevator." A flicker of humor touched the edge of her tone, just enough to soften the moment. He almost smiled. "Almost. Then why now?" he repeated. Her eyes softened, just slightly. "Because they started asking questions I can't answer alone." The simplicity of that statement carried more force than any legal notice. Felicity leaned against Zuri's leg. "Mommy said you're smart," she told Richard. "Are you?" He let out a breath that almost became a laugh. "I try to be." "Then figure it out," Abigail said quietly. "Children do not complicate what adults overthink." Richard straightened slowly. "I never meant to disappear," he said to Zuri. She studied him carefully. "Intent doesn't erase impact," she replied. He nodded. He couldn't argue that. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. She didn't hesitate this time. "I want you to show up Not write a check. Not issue a statement. Show up. The traffic light shifted behind them. Pedestrians surged forward across the intersection. Time moving. Choices narrowing. He looked back toward the tower. Then at the twins. Then at Zuri. The merger upstairs could be salvaged. The investor had postponed. Reputation could be managed. But presence required something different. It required him. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. Her expression softened again. You start by not walking away. The words settled between them, steady and unadorned. No theatrics, no threats, just invitation. The twins waited, hopeful, not demanding. And in that open stretch of sidewalk, beneath skyscrapers built on ambition and asphalt, layered with decades of stories, something fragile hovered between them. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness. Possibility. Closure isn't revenge. It's truth. For a moment, no one moved. The traffic light shifted again. Pedestrians flowed past them in waves, coats brushing shoulders, briefcases swinging, someone laughing too loudly at something on their phone. New York kept breathing. Zuri adjusted her grip on Felicity's hand. We should go, she said quietly, though she didn't turn away. Richard's gaze flickered toward the tower again, 47 floors of ambition rising behind him, then back to the 3 people standing in front of him. I spoke to the investor, he said. Zuri didn't look surprised. I figured. He postponed the meeting. She nodded once. He seems observant. There was a subtle weight in the way she said it. Richard caught it. You knew him? He asked. She held his eyes. Not personally, but... She hesitated. Not dramatically, just thoughtfully. Do you remember the charity gala 2 years ago? The one you were photographed at? He frowned slightly. Yes, I was there, she said. That startled him. You were? Yes, different room, same event. He searched his memory. Crowded ballroom. Speeches, flashing cameras. I saw him watching you, she continued. Watching how people responded when you spoke. Richard's brow tightened. What does that have to do with this? Zuri exhaled slowly. After the girls were born, I never filed for child support. He blinked. I know, he said carefully. I could have, she continued. The law's clear. The timeline was clear. The message I sent was clear. Her voice remained steady. I didn't. Why? He asked again. Because I didn't want to trap you, she said simply. I wanted you to choose. The wind pressed lightly against them, carrying the faint scent of roasted nuts from a nearby vendor. Richard absorbed her words. You think I would have chosen differently if you'd forced it? He asked. No, she replied. I think you would have resented it. That honesty cut clean. Felicity tugged at Zuri's coat. Are we going home? She asked. In a minute, Zuri said softly. Richard's mind raced. You said you saw him watching me, he returned. Yes, and I later learned he had someone look into you more closely. His stomach tightened. Look into me, how? As investors do, she answered. Background, risk, exposure. The word exposure lingered. And he found, Richard prompted. Zuri met his gaze steadily. He found the text message. Richard's breath stalled. You told him? I didn't have to, she said. Digital trails don't disappear. The sidewalk noise felt distant suddenly. He knew about the twins? Richard asked. Yes. For how long? Months. The word landed heavy. Richard replayed recent conversations in his head. The investor's subtle questions, the emphasis on character, the repeated use of words like integrity and stability. He delayed the merger? Richard asked slowly. Zuri nodded. From what I understand, yes. Not to sabotage. To observe. To test me, Richard whispered. Maybe, she replied. Or maybe he wanted to see if the man building his portfolio was whole. Richard ran a hand over his face. The realization settled in layers. The elevator. The hallway. The questions in the boardroom. None of it had been accidental. The investor had known there was something unresolved. He had simply waited. Abigail looked up at Richard with open curiosity. Are you in trouble? She asked softly. He crouched again, shaking his head. No, he said. I'm being given a chance. The innocence of that statement surprised even him. Zuri watched him carefully. You see, she said gently, this was never about money. He looked at her. I know that now. I didn't want your wealth, she continued. I wanted clarity. For them, and for you. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked, though he already knew the answer. I did, she said quietly. The text, delivered, unanswered. Silence is sometimes interpreted as consent, other times as abandonment. Richard stood slowly. So this entire merger, he began, was never just about business, Zuri finished. Behind them, the tower reflected the sky without emotion. Richard glanced up at it. He had thought he was steering every outcome, but outcomes have a way of steering you. The investor had not confronted him privately. He had allowed the moment to surface organically, publicly enough to test reaction, privately enough to avoid spectacle. Calculated, strategic, human. Richard looked back at Zuri. You knew this might happen, he said. I hoped it would, she replied. Not with bitterness, with resolve. Felicity squeezed his hand suddenly. Does this mean you're coming with us? She asked. The question cut through corporate strategy and adult history with childlike precision. Richard looked at Zuri. She didn't answer for him. She never had. You have a choice, she said softly. The same way she had said it years ago before he boarded that plane. 3 months. Temporary. He had chosen expansion then. What would he choose now? The investor had not demanded perfection. He had demanded alignment. Alignment between public narrative and private truth. Richard exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, the path forward was not about scale. It was about presence. He looked at the twins, then at Zuri, then back at the tower, and something inside him settled. Not completely, but enough. Because sometimes the real negotiation isn't across a table. It's inside your own chest. And as traffic surged past, and the city refused to pause for anyone's awakening, one truth rose clear above the noise. Sometimes the deal was never the deal. Richard didn't go back upstairs. He didn't check his phone. He didn't call his assistant. Instead, he looked at Zuri and said, carefully, almost like he was testing the words before releasing them, Can I spend the day with them? Zuri studied him. Not suspicious, not softened, measured. The whole day? She asked. Yes, Felicity gasped. Like a field trip? Abigail's eyes widened. Are we going somewhere? Richard glanced towards Central Park, just a few blocks north, the trees rising like something older than the buildings around them. The zoo, he said. The word felt ordinary, grounded, safe. Zuri hesitated, then nodded once. I'll come, she said. He didn't argue. He wouldn't have earned that yet. The walk to the park felt longer than usual. Felicity skipped slightly ahead, narrating everything she saw. Pigeons, street performers, a dog wearing tiny boots. Abigail walked closer to Richard, occasionally glancing up at him as if confirming he was still there. He was. That alone felt new. At the zoo entrance, he paid for the tickets without ceremony. No grand gestures, just presence. Inside, the air shifted from traffic noise to the muted sounds of children laughing and animals moving behind glass. Felicity ran toward the sea lion exhibit first. They're dancing, she declared. They're swimming, Abigail corrected quietly. Richard stood between them, unsure where to look. Do you like animals? Felicity asked. I think I'm still deciding, he admitted. She squinted at him. You decide a lot. The honesty made him pause. Yes, he said slowly. I do. They moved toward the penguin enclosure. Abigail pressed her hands gently against the cool glass. They stay together, she observed. Richard crouched beside her. Penguins? He asked. She nodded. They pick one partner. The statement landed deeper than she intended. He swallowed. I didn't know that, he said. Zuri watched from a few feet away, arms folded loosely. Not defensive, just present. At the petting zoo section, Felicity insisted on feeding the goats. Richard hesitated before reaching into the small paper bag of feed. They won't bite, Felicity assured him confidently. I've negotiated with tougher, he murmured. She laughed loudly. That laugh. It echoed in his chest in a way boardroom applause never had. Later, sitting on a bench near the carousel, he handed them both small cups of vanilla ice cream. Abigail ate slowly, careful not to drip. Felicity already had a streak across her cheek. "You're messy," Abigail whispered. "It's art," Felicity replied proudly. Richard reached into his pocket instinctively for a handkerchief. Stopped. Smiled faintly. He used a napkin instead. Zuri noticed. She didn't comment. There were moments of awkwardness. When Felicity asked, "Why didn't you come to my birthday?" When Abigail asked, "Do you live in that tall building?" When both of them tried to hold his hands at once, and he hesitated just a fraction too long before adjusting. But he didn't deflect. He didn't promise what he couldn't deliver. "I should have been there," he said when Felicity asked about birthdays. She nodded once, satisfied. Children don't need perfect explanations. They need acknowledgement. As the afternoon softened, they found themselves near the central lawn of Central Park. Sunlight filtered through the trees. Musicians played faintly near a fountain. A man painted portraits nearby while couples sat cross-legged on blankets. The twins chased each other in uneven circles while Richard and Zuri sat on a bench. He watched them run. "They're different," he said quietly. "Yes," Zuri replied. "Felicity jumps before she looks." Zuri smiled faintly. "That's accurate." "And Abigail," he continued, "she watches before she moves." Zuri glanced at him. "You're paying attention." "I'm trying." There was humility in that admission, not performance. Trying. The twins ran back toward them, slightly out of breath. "Push us," Felicity demanded, pointing toward a nearby swing set. Richard stood immediately. "Both at once?" he asked. "We're twins," Abigail said logically. He positioned himself between the swings, pushing carefully at first, too gently. "Harder," Felicity shouted. He increased the momentum. Their laughter rose into the air, bright and uncomplicated. He adjusted his stance, timing the pushes evenly so neither felt slighted. Balance. It felt symbolic. Zuri watched quietly. Her posture relaxed just slightly. Not fully, but enough. After the swings, the twins insisted on walking between him and Zuri, each grabbing one of his hands without asking permission. He froze for a split second, then allowed it. Their fingers were small, warm, certain. They walked like that past families, joggers, tourists. An ordinary sight, an extraordinary shift. "Are you coming tomorrow too?" Felicity asked suddenly. He hesitated. Not out of fear, out of realism. "I want to," he said honestly. Abigail looked up at him. "Then come." Simple, clear. He met Zuri's eyes over their heads. No grand declarations passed between them, just understanding. Because fatherhood doesn't begin with certainty. It begins with learning, with showing up imperfectly, with answering questions you once avoided. And as the afternoon light stretched long across the grass and the twins pulled him toward another exhibit he hadn't yet seen, Richard felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not completion, responsibility, alive and immediate. Fatherhood doesn't arrive with a contract. It arrives with questions. By the time the sun began to lower, the air carried that soft golden tint that makes even New York feel gentler. They left Central Park slowly. Felicity insisted on walking backward for half a block, narrating the shapes of clouds. Abigail held Richard's hand without saying much, her thumb tracing small circles against his palm as if confirming he was still real. Zuri walked beside them, not behind, not ahead. Beside. When they reached the Harlem brownstone where she lived, the twins ran up the steps first. Shoes off, Abigail reminded her sister before the door even opened. Zuri unlocked the door and turned to Richard. "You can come up," she said. Not warm, not cold, neutral. He nodded. Inside, the apartment carried the faint scent of lavender and something baked earlier in the week. The living room held crayon drawings taped carefully along one wall. A small bookshelf leaned slightly under the weight of children's stories and legal textbooks side by side. Life layered, real. The twins dropped their shoes and immediately began describing the zoo in overlapping sentences. "The penguins stay together, and the goats like me more, and he pushed us higher than you do, Mommy." Zuri smiled faintly at that last one. "I'll compete later," she replied. Dinner was simple. Pasta, salad, water in mismatched cups. Richard sat at the small kitchen table that barely accommodated 4 chairs. His suit jacket hung over the back of one, slightly out of place in a room built for practicality rather than prestige. He listened more than he spoke. When Felicity asked him to pass the salt, he did. When Abigail corrected her sister's memory of how many sea lions there were, he nodded thoughtfully. After dinner, Zuri began clearing plates. Richard stood instinctively. "I can help," he said. She looked at him for a moment, then handed him a dish towel. No ceremony, just participation. They worked quietly side by side at the sink. The twins argued gently in the living room about which stuffed animal deserved the bed's center position. "Thank you," Zuri said finally. "For what?" he asked. "For today." He nodded once. "I should have done it sooner." "Yes," she said. No argument, just agreement. When the twins finished brushing their teeth, they insisted on a story. Together, Abigail specified. So Richard sat on the edge of the bed, while Zuri leaned against the doorway. He read slowly, occasionally stumbling over character voices. Felicity corrected him twice. Abigail giggled once. By the final page, both girls were sleepy. "Will you be here when we wake up?" Felicity asked. Richard hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of respect for truth. "I can't stay tonight," he said gently. Abigail frowned slightly. "But I'll see you tomorrow," he continued. That satisfied them enough. "Promise?" Felicity asked. "I promise," he said. After they drifted to sleep, the apartment grew quieter. Not silent, just settled. Zuri stepped into the hallway. Richard stood near the kitchen table again, jacket folded over his arm. They faced each other without the buffer of children's voices. "This doesn't fix 5 years," she said. "I know, and I'm not interested in pretending it does. I wouldn't ask you to." She studied him carefully. "What changed?" she asked. He considered the question honestly. "The boardroom," he said first. She waited. "And the way they looked at me when they asked if the girls were mine." He paused. "But mostly, the way they looked at me." Her eyes softened, just slightly. "You're not the only one who carried silence," she said quietly. He nodded. "I see that now." There was no dramatic apology speech, no kneeling confession, just truth offered plainly. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Of what?" she asked. "Of losing momentum, of looking weak, of not knowing how to do this well." She let that settle. "You don't get to skip the hard part because you're afraid," she said gently. "I know. And showing up once doesn't prove anything." "I know." Silence lingered for a moment, but this time it wasn't avoidance. It was assessment. "I don't hate you," she said finally. Relief flickered across his face before he could stop it. "But I don't trust you yet either." "That's fair. Trust is rebuilt in increments, not declarations." "Why didn't you answer?" she asked quietly. The question she had held for 5 years. He inhaled slowly. "I thought I would," he said. "I thought things would calm down, that I'd have the right words, the right timing. And then it became harder to explain the silence than to continue it." She nodded once. "That's honest." He stepped a little closer, not invading, not retreating. "I can't undo what I didn't do," he said. "But I can decide what I do now." She held his gaze. "Decide carefully." He nodded. "I will." The city outside hummed faintly through the windows, sirens in the distance, laughter from the sidewalk, a train rumbling beneath the streets. Life continuing. "I'm not asking for forgiveness tonight," he added. She studied him one last time. "Good," she said softly. "Why?" "Because forgiveness isn't given on demand." She turned toward the doorway. He moved toward the door. Before leaving, he paused. "Tomorrow," he said. "Yes," she replied. And as he stepped out into the hallway and the door closed gently behind him, one truth remained suspended between what was broken and what might still be built. Forgiveness isn't a door. It's a bridge. Richard did not sleep much that night. Not because of anxiety, because of clarity. His apartment overlooking Central Park felt different when he walked in. The marble floors, the quiet echo of his own footsteps, the skyline stretching beyond glass. Everything looked exactly the same, but it didn't feel the same. He loosened his tie and stood by the window, watching headlights trace lines below. For years, those lights represented momentum, deals closing, markets opening, expansion unfolding across continents. Tonight, they looked like movement without direction. He picked up his phone, scrolled past unread emails, past financial alerts, past congratulatory messages about the merger's expected success. Then he stopped. He dialed the investor. It rang twice. "Richard," the investor answered calmly. "I need to speak plainly," Richard said. "I assumed you would—" Silence rested on the line for a moment. Not strained, just deliberate. "I'm postponing the merger," Richard said. "For how long?" the investor asked. "As long as necessary." There was no sharp intake of breath, no outrage, only evaluation. "Because of the children?" the investor asked. "Yes, and because of you," Richard added quietly. A pause. "Explain." "I built this company on the idea of integrity," Richard said. "I can't ask partners to trust me if I'm unwilling to confront my own failures." The investor exhaled softly. "Markets will speculate," he warned. "They already do. And shareholders? They will adjust. And your reputation?" Richard looked out the window again. "It will reflect the truth." Another pause. Then, "Good," the investor said. Richard blinked. "You're not angry?" "I am interested," the investor replied. "In men who align their private decisions with their public values." Richard absorbed that. "The test was never about numbers," the investor continued. "It was about who I was investing in." Richard understood that now. "I won't waste it," he said. "I expect you won't," the investor answered. The call ended without ceremony. No applause. No drama. Just direction. The next morning, Richard arrived in Harlem before the twins woke up. He stood outside the brownstone for a moment, looking up at the windows. The building wasn't impressive. The paint on the railing was slightly chipped. The stoop held the faint marks of years of weather and children's chalk drawings. But it felt grounded, real. He knocked gently. Zuri opened the door, surprised but composed. "You're early," she said. "I said I'd be here." She stepped aside. Inside, the apartment carried the soft quiet of early morning. He could hear one twin shifting in bed, murmuring something about penguins. He smiled faintly. Over breakfast, he didn't dominate the conversation. He listened. When Felicity asked if he would come to school pickup next week, he said yes, and meant it. When Abigail asked if he could help with homework, he said yes, and planned for it. Later that afternoon, they walked together down the sidewalk. Not hurried, not posed. Felicity insisted on holding his left hand. Abigail claimed the right. Zuri walked beside them. A small formation, unremarkable to strangers, monumental to them. They passed a street musician playing softly near the corner, a saxophone drifting through Harlem air. Richard paused briefly. Zuri noticed. "You hear it differently now?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes." The twins pulled him forward. "Come on," Felicity urged. He laughed and followed. As they reached the edge of Marcus Garvey Park, the city moved around them in its usual rhythm. Joggers passing, elders seated on benches, children racing down the steps. Life did not stop to document their shift. It simply welcomed it. Richard looked at the twins, then at Zuri. He didn't pretend everything was repaired. He didn't assume tomorrow would be simple. He understood now that presence required repetition, consistency, patience. He squeezed both small hands gently. Zuri met his eyes, not with full trust, not with resentment, with cautious openness. That was enough. Because redemption rarely arrives as a grand gesture. It arrives in mornings, in homework, in zoo tickets, in honest phone calls, in postponed mergers. The elevator had once felt like a confessional, a space where truth cornered him. Now the sidewalk felt like something else, a beginning. And as the twins swung their arms between them, laughing about nothing in particular, Richard felt the weight of his name settle differently on his shoulders. Not as brand, as responsibility. When your past rides the elevator into your future, do you step out unchanged? Or do you step forward as someone new? The choice is always yours.